If you'll remember back to the model of argument discussed earlier this week, we had those three essentials of an argument: claim, support, and warrant. And we've talked about claims. Those are your main points in this impromptu speech. Now let's go ahead and turn our attention to support. And in fact, next week we're going to be talking about how you build that bridge from the support to the claim. We'll be talking about that warrant. So what is the role of support? Well, remember that support, that evidence, is there to validate the claim. And it's important to remember the job of support, because this focus on the role of support is that it helps you come up with better evidence and discuss that evidence in a more targeted way. So the nice thing about this is you can start identifying more when and how you or others start kind of going off topic in discussion of a point. So given that, how do you go about dialing in on the necessary support that you need for your claims? Well, as you did when you were coming up with main points, I think a question prompt is useful here. So as you look at your claims that you've prepped there, you look at each one and you say, well, what knowledge or experience am I basing my belief on here? And in responding to that question, we're keeping two things in mind. First, does the evidence relate to the main point it's supporting? And second, is that evidence concrete? Now, clearly the evidence should relate to the main point it's supporting. Your job is explaining that relevance. But indeed, your life is a lot easier, your job is a lot easier if that evidence is clearly relevant to the claim that it's advancing. But beyond that, it should be concrete. And by this, I mean you've got details. There are examples, specific things that you can talk about in that support. Because without that, you're going to run into problems. The more detail that there is in your support, the more you can do to relate it to the claim. If your support is overly vague, you really won't have that much to talk about. You'll kind of run through that point pretty quickly. I'm going to ask you to prep and run an impromptu at the end of this video. Usually what we see is when people first start doing these impromptus, they're coming up pretty short. So they're running about 2 minutes instead of 5 or 6 minutes. And 9 times out of 10, it is because that evidence, that support that you're using in the impromptu is too vague. There's not enough detail or concreteness in that point. So you really want to be thinking about, can I populate the support with examples that I can explain and describe and relate to that claim? You can use hypothetical examples, right? You know, in many cases, that might be the best evidence that you've got at hand. But those hypothetical examples had better be plausible examples because they are there to validate the claim that you're making. So what I'd like to do as a way of sort of demonstrating and talking about evidence in an impromptu speech is I'm just going to go ahead and compose and deliver a single point from an impromptu. I'll actually do another full impromptu next week, but for this demonstration, I've chosen this as a thesis statement. MOOC providers like Coursera, edX, so on and so forth, should not pressure universities to award credit for MOOC classes. And the reason I'm going with this example is I want to use an accessible example for this class. You may not have a deep investment in this topic, and that's fine. At the end of this lecture, I'm going to ask you to argue the counter case, and I'll probably argue the counter case next week. But I just want to make sure that we've all got something that kind of makes sense to this particular online audience. But for this thesis, I would have these main points. Such pressure would restrict the diversity of MOOCs, and such pressure wouldn't really work. And you can see here my 2 pieces of support for each claim. First, it limits the range of classes, and second, it limits the range of universities. And then the faculty who make these decisions are generally immune from MOOC pressure, and such pressure would only increase faculty ill will. So I'm just going to perform from the introduction all the way through the first main point. And I want you to pay particular attention to the relevance of the evidence as well as the concreteness that I use in discussing the evidence. So let me go ahead and do this short impromptu on that thesis statement. I'm pretty invested now in the discussion around MOOCs. I've taught a MOOC, I've taken MOOCs, I've written on MOOCs. I've spent a lot of time around MOOCs. Now, I certainly understand why people, MOOC providers, students, would want to award credit for MOOCs. Nevertheless, I argue that MOOC providers like Coursera and edX should not pressure universities to award university credit for MOOC classes. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. Two particularly stand out to me. One is that such pressure would restrict the diversity of MOOCs, and that's a bad thing. But beyond that, I don't actually think this pressure would work, and so it's kind of unnecessary to do it even in the first place. But let me turn to this idea that pressuring for credit would restrict the diversity of MOOCs. I don't think this is where we want to be moving. I think it would restrict the diversity of MOOCs because it would limit the range of classes that are available online, and it would probably limit the range of universities that are willing to participate in MOOCs. So how would it restrict the diversity of classes? Well, there are a lot of classes that I can think of that don't operate on a credit basis. So the public speaking class, the public speaking MOOC, does not operate on a credit basis. And so that would be out of the running if there was this real emphasis on credit. And the public speaking class is not alone. There are a lot of humanities classes where it's going to be skill development or music classes, and those classes would not be welcome if there was such a heavy emphasis on credit. And that would restrict their diversity of online offerings. I don't think that's good. But beyond that, it would also limit the range of universities that are willing to participate. So right now, a lot of universities opt out of doing MOOCs anyway. But if we started seeing a demand for credit, that opting out would only increase. So for example, Duke University. Duke University runs some MOOCs, but they've been very clear that they're not going to offer any credit. And any attempts to offer credit are met with a strong response from their faculty senate. So overall, I think we'd see a decrease in the diversity of classes and the diversity of universities participating in MOOCs, and that's kind of the opposite direction of where MOOCs should head in if they're truly about educational access. And then I would move on to point 2. So there you've got kind of the introduction and that first main point. So we can go back and look at that evidence. So in my 1A, my first piece of evidence for my first claim, it limits the diversity of classes. Well, does that relate to the claim? Sure. My job is to show this, but limiting the range of classes and limiting the diversity of MOOCs, that kind of makes sense. Those are very similar. Is it concrete? Yeah, I got examples. I've got this class, but I've also got other humanities classes that illustrate this point. Then you look at the 1B. It limits the diversity of universities. Well, certainly there I can talk through that Duke case. So that's kind of what I want that evidence to do, what you want that evidence to do. So now let's have you do it. So I want you to craft up evidence for a claim, and we're going to argue the opposite case. So here's the thesis, and I'll even give you the main points. So the thesis is MOOC providers should pressure universities to award credit for MOOC classes. And here's why. Here are the claims I want you to come up with, that I want you to work with. A focus on credit improves a MOOC's quality, and universities can always opt out of credit. So in essence, this point is saying pressure is not the same thing as demand. So I want you to draft up evidence for these claims and try running through the speech. Now, in point 1, you're probably going to want evidence, cases where credit equals quality. And in point 2, you probably want examples where pressure isn't the same thing as demanding. So that's what I want you to do now. Take this, prep those pieces of evidence, and practice this. Practice running this, and practice thinking through the standards of evidence and how they shape the discussion of each one of those main points.